Welcome, everyone. Today we're talking about a very important topic: ego death. We have a lot to go over in regards to this topic because from the very beginning, the word ego brings about a wide variety of understandings and concepts, not all of which are compatible with each other, and which may not be compatible or may not be the right way that we have to understand the ego in terms of our spiritual work, in terms of our Gnostic psychological work. Obviously, the word ego simply means I or self in the most basic sense. That's the literal translation. So it's a word that has many different definitions. When we talk about the ego in this tradition, it's important that we know exactly what we're talking about so that we're all in agreement. Now, in terms of ego death, this is also a term that's used in various schools and traditions. Exactly what that means is, or may be, different than what some people believe it to be. So let's begin with a discussion about what exactly the ego is. How different schools or traditions have understood this concept. Now, one of the most popular ways that the ego has been talked about is the sort of classical psychoanalytic school of Freud. So in the Freudian psyche, a lot of people who might have taken Psych 101 in college may have gotten a superficial or introductory explanation in this sense. And the ego is between two other structures, according to the psychoanalytic theory, which is the superego and the id. And the way that Freud conceptualized all this is that we have these lower instinctual desires, which is the id. And the id isn't rational at all. And then you have the superego, which is where our moral and rational sense comes from. And in between there, stuck in between, is the ego, which attempts to live in accordance with those morals and ideals coming from the superego, but must also realistically somehow satisfy the instinctual desires of the id. So in accordance with this theory, the ego is very necessary in order to mediate between these two conflictual elements or apparatuses within ourselves. From the view of the tradition that we're coming from, this is both useful but also different than what we call the ego. Because in actuality, all three of these, from our perspective, is the ego. So we have to understand that a lot of times when we talk about the ego, people will place an understanding in their own head in relationship to this framework. And a lot of confusion occurs. In reality, the ego is related to a mechanical type of consciousness, an unconsciousness. And it's very obvious that all three of these layers, in accordance with the Freudian psyche, they're all related to being mechanical. So all three of these layers are the same ego. Now, sometimes in certain places, Samael Aun Weor will talk about the superior eye and the inferior eye. And particularly in some of his later works, he makes a clear statement that whether we talk about the superior or the inferior eye, it is the same eye. And we find a sort of similitude here with the Freudian psyche, because the superego is sort of like the superior eye. It's still the I, though. It's still the self. It tries to be a good person. It tries to live in accordance with these rational teachings, moral teachings, trying to be, quote unquote, a good person, whatever that might be. And in some senses, that's better than just living by brute instinctual desires and never reflecting, even on a superficial sense, even conceptually or intellectually, on those desires. And there is something to be said about someone who at least can get enough of their desires under control that they can kind of do things in the world. But don't confuse that capability with an awakened consciousness. Don't confuse that superior I with something that is ultimately useful. Because in the end, that superior I, that superego, causes all the same problems, suffering, and leaves us impoverished, ultimately, in the end. So, if we move forward, we could take a look at how the ego is viewed in a more general sense in popular psychology. Not necessarily a way of, specifically relating it to Freud or anything like that. But when we talk about having an ego or a big ego in just our common nomenclature, we think about the ego in terms of an exaggerated sense of self. Someone has a big ego. Someone's very proud of themselves. Someone who is arrogant. Maybe someone who is materialistic, selfish. Someone who is argumentative, truculent, or bellicose. This is all true. This is all related to the ego. But we have to go a lot deeper than this. The ego is not simply something related to an exaggerated sense of self. It's not simply related to these very obvious issues that the ego has. These are outwardly symptoms that are particularly selfish. But the ego is a lot more than this. So we have to go a lot deeper. We can also see the ego in terms of religion. When we relate, how does religion talk about the ego? They don't obviously use that word, ego. But in terms of our spiritual work, we can be very clear that the ego is related to all those negative elements that are against God, against truth, against reality. And in various traditions, there are different words and concepts for what is ultimately within us, the ego. The ego is a cause of our sins. The ego is Satan. It is the klipot of Kabbalah. It is the kleshas, which is a very important word in both Hinduism and Buddhism. And the ego is that demon or that minotaur, that Medusa, that dragon that has to be slain, that has to be overcome, and all of those myths we, as spiritual aspirants who are looking to improve ourselves, we need to understand religion from a psychological component. And in truth, every true tradition has that psychological component, that inner component. So we may not be often taught in that way. It may often, we may often see the traditional ways in which religion talks about things, and it externalizes all of these elements to things that are outside. But we have to realize that all of those things are actually aspects and characteristics that we carry within. That is the true teaching. So depending on the tradition, depending on the school, some talk about that very clearly, and other schools hide it, or they may not even know that the true teaching is to look within. So the ego, it's much better to say that the ego is that which is against reality, that which is confused about the truth. That is a much more complete understanding than to simply say that the ego is when you feel very arrogant, or when you are angry, or when you're very prideful. All those things certainly are the ego, but they don't capture the essence. Now, to say that the ego is against reality or against truth, this is a much better definition, but we need to go and unfold this so that we can better understand it. And what I think is a much better way of understanding this is to say that the ego is conditioned consciousness. The ego is unconscious. It's the unconscious activity. It is unaware. It does not have awareness of all of that which is going on within. The ego is identified. It places attention inappropriately. It places attention in such a way that it is based upon something that is not true. This is called identification. To be identified means you're placing attention and reifying or making something more real than it actually is. Because the type of self that we believe ourselves to have, that we just what we call our self, our sense of self, this is actually, it's what we have to examine, because what we'll find out is it does not exist at all in the way that we believe it to exist. We carry enormous assumptions about it, and we are identified with that. The ego is mechanical, meaning that it responds, it reacts, better said, almost like a machine would respond. If you push a certain button, the machine responds to that button. And we have the phrase that we often use, he or she really knows how to push my buttons. This is our way of understanding that, yes, we are mechanical. We get triggered. We respond in certain ways just by the way someone looks or appears, or how they say something to us. And in the more comprehensive way to understand this is to say that the ego is conditioned. Now, it is conditioned consciousness. What the consciousness is something we're going to talk about in just a moment. So we can summarize this by saying that our ego is our distorted perceptions and our distorted understanding. Ultimately, these two things are very similar, but to divide them a little bit, perceptions is what you see, not just visually, but the way that you see things even internally in your dreams or in your imagination, or how you visualize something. Your capability of seeing deeper or more subtle levels of reality is filtered and conditioned by the ego. In the same way, if you take a pane of glass and you put something over it, that obscures the light. That light is filtered. But also the ego has a confused understanding. Because remember, you can see something but not understand what it is. You may see something, but then misunderstand it. This happens all the time. When we have a dream, we see the dream, we remember the dream, but we don't understand it. That lack of understanding is also related to the ego. Sometimes we believe that we understand something, but it's actually a misapprehension, a misunderstanding, a confused understanding. So from these distorted perceptions and distorted understandings, as a response, what comes out of us are confused volitions, which a simple term for that is our desires. Volitions just simply means our actions. But confused volitions are volitions that are based upon a confused sense of reality, a distorted reality. And that's what our desires are. And it produces our confused mental activity. Subtle ways in which our mind responds and reacts. The way the different, we can say, cascades of interactions that go on inside of ourselves. Simply how, observing something causes one thought, and one thought causes another thought. But then another thought that's exactly the opposite, and we feel conflicted between two. And then we might have different emotions that emerge out of that. And if that keeps going, then we end up having a very disturbed and confused and conflicted state within ourselves. So all these things cascade. Another way to understand what our ego is to simply say, that our ego is our personal algorithm. What does that mean? It means that we have a personal type of programming, and that programming is our ego. We've been conditioned, we've been programmed. Now, who's at fault for this? Ultimately, it's ourself. That's the ultimate agent that needs to be blamed here. Ultimately, we are responsible for what's in ourself, what's in our mind, what's in our ego. But we get conditioned by all of the experiences of life, of all of the moments of pleasure and pain. And because we have this type of root ignorance, we get confused by the world, and we learn the wrong things. We respond in the wrong way. We end up conditioning our own consciousness. We build this ego. And just like I said before, where you can have your own, buttons that someone can push. That's like another way, a more modern way of saying it is that we have our own personal algorithm, our own personal programming. And what's interesting is that the big tech companies know this, and they are producing a type of learning in their own, cloud, in the cloud machines. All the data that they're collecting from us when we're on our social media, they are learning what we like to pay attention to. So they're learning our algorithm. And then they give us back in certain videos that they recommend, or certain advertisements, or certain content, certain news articles, that's going to play back into our algorithm to push our buttons. They've found a way to observe and with their own sort of algorithm, learn any particular person. And they're very good at it. They've managed to be very good at it because they present things that are drawing our attention to it. And it plays and cascades within all of our elements inside. And we are being reinforced with all those negative things that we're paying. We like to pay attention to certain things. It doesn't mean it's good for us. We like to pay attention to things. It doesn't mean it's healthy for our consciousness. It just means that we're attracted to it. We have an attraction to a certain type of content, certain type of sensation. So that's our personal algorithm. We have to learn it. Even though we are it, we don't know what it is. We have to learn it so that we can destroy it. So we have to become an engineer in this sense. We have to reverse engineer our own ego. We have to pull it apart, see how all of the things interact. We have to see how we're wired inside. And nobody can do it but yourself. You can't get around this problem. You can't get around the problem of your ego by doing lots of prayers and asking to have your suffering removed. Prayers are very helpful and very good. But in the end, you have to remove the causes of your suffering, which is your ego. You have to learn your own algorithm. So, one other way to understand this sense of ego that we have a little bit better is the understanding that not everything with the ego is experienced as painful. There's a lot to do with our ego. Ultimately, that is all of our suffering. But in the moment, at any particular moment, something maybe feel very enjoyable, and that's still your ego. So when circumstances arrive that's in harmony with your desires, that's in harmony with your algorithm, that's in harmony with your programming, then you feel good about that. And that's sort of what might be called in modern psychology as ego syntonic. To be in sympathy with the conditioning of our ego. So even though it's our ego, it's enjoyable. So if you have a certain attachment, certain desire, and then that happens, you achieve it, your ego feels satiated, your desires feel satiated. But ultimately, you end up experiencing a lot more suffering because every time you satiate your ego, you are not just feeling the results of your attachments, you're actually feeding the energy back into that programming, back into your ego. So it actually strengthens your ego. So the more you are attached and then you are identified with those results that you're attached to, that identification is what's called inappropriate attention. It's inappropriate because you're attending to the thing you're desiring, to the thing you are identified with, and that attention is a faculty of your consciousness. And the faculty of your consciousness, when it's paying attention to something in this way, it's going to actually cause a result of a more conditioned consciousness. It's just like putting more energy into your conditioning. Now, obviously, the other side, we know the ego causes our suffering. Because ultimately, all of these desires and conditionings, we cannot change the world in such a way that we always have them met in addition to this, since our ego is always growing, even if we're managed to have some periods or chapters in our life where we're able to meet them a lot, at some point it falls apart to some degree or another, in which case intense suffering is the result. Because our attachments keep growing, and then once we're not able to live up to that, then of course we have the opposite of ego syntonic experience, which is ego dystonic experience. It simply means something the ego doesn't like. So these are all of the half of our ego that everybody already understands, which is all of our anxiety, depression, fear, pain, suffering. It's very clear when it's like that. So in truth, that's the best place to start, with all those experiences that are obviously suffering. But in the end, you need to keep going and observe both sides of that coin, because they are the same thing ultimately. You have to see how all of those moments that appeared to be so enjoyable are actually related to attachment, and then see how that identification then leads back to the other side of those very outwardly forms of suffering. We often plant the seeds of our suffering today, but we don't know it until those fruits appear later in our life, and we realize that we were actually attached and identified in an inappropriate way, that we're putting energy into something. So we have to become observant and aware, because we can still enjoy things, and we should endeavor to have peace and equanimity in our life. But in the beginning, it's difficult because we're so attached to everything. We don't know when it's mechanical attachment and when it's a bit of our liberated free consciousness that is simply naturally enjoying the world without attachment. So now that we've talked a lot about the ego, we have to contrast it with what is not the ego in order to separate or know what we're talking about here. So on this slide, we've taken our composition and put it into 3 basic levels in order to simplify this. In other lectures, we talk about the tree of life, and we can split everything into 10 or even 13 levels, plus the inferior worlds. So we could really talk about this in a very more sophisticated way. But at its core, at the bottom, of course, we have our physical body, which we should be somewhat familiar with, right? And then we have our soul or our consciousness, or sometimes it's called the mind. These terms at a superficial or general level are very much interchangeable. Like I said, when we get more specific, these become, there's different terms that get a little bit more into the details of things. But for this level of lecture, those 3 words are very, very similar. Those are the same thing. And then there's the spirit, which is not the soul or consciousness or mind. So we simply can say the spirit, the soul, and the body. And what does this mean? What is the difference? Most specifically, because I think we understand what the body is, but what is the difference between the soul and the spirit? The soul is what we consider when we have this sense of self, it is related to our soul. But the soul is something that has the ability to do good or to do bad. It has the ability to be the sinner or the saint, the hero or the devil. Our soul is trapped by our ego. The ego is a false type of creation. The Pistis Sophia calls the ego a counterfeiting spirit. It's a counterfeit light. We believe all the time that we are led by true impulses, but it really is just our egotistical desires. And this is our confusion. This is why we don't have complete knowledge, because we've been obscured, we're trapped. But what is the truth within ourselves is what we call the spirit, which is our inner light. Our inner light is something which has complete purity. It shines upon the soul. And in the moments when the soul is more receptive, capable of receiving, it too shines this light into the world through the physical outer vehicle, through the body. But if the soul is taken away, if it becomes identified with the counterfeit light, with the ego, then it doesn't do what it ought to, which is to receive that spiritual light. So the spirit is like our guiding star. It is our interior star that shines upon us. We have, at any particular moment, the capacity to discover and to see, to receive, and to perceive that light within ourselves. This is a light of a spiritual nature. This is something that illuminates us. And when we are capable of seeing our ego for what it is because it is illuminated by that light. So we are stuck in the middle, so to speak. The soul yearns to reunite with the spirit. So a part of us, when we talk about our potential is infinite because the spirit comes from the infinite light. Because beyond our individual spirit is the universal spirit. And our soul has the ability to understand all of that, to merge with that. But we are not in that place or in that condition because we have the ego. So this is the problem. This is the problem we have to solve. A lot of people think that they can become more spiritual by adopting a different set of beliefs, by changing something exterior, by putting their physical body close to someone else who might be spiritual, or by attending some group. Now, obviously, we have to listen to the teachings, and if there's a good place to listen, go somewhere to do that, to be part of a good group, obviously that's very good. But none of that gives us any guarantee that our soul is going to change. So people will go to the end of the world, the end of the earth, in order to become more spiritual. But will people will go to the end of the earth to become more spiritual, but will they reject, or will we reject our own desires right here and now within ourselves? That's what's required. There's a concept of refuge in Buddhism. You take refuge in the teachings, in the teacher, and the Buddha. People might go around the world to find that. But we need to take refuge within our inner spiritual light, which isn't done by any exterior means. We take constantly refuge in our ego. Every time that unpleasant situations appear, we hide in our ego instead of looking at ourselves and realizing that the thing that's causing the suffering is actually our ego itself. So instead of taking refuge in our spirit and seeing the ugliness of the ego, we take refuge in the ego and blame some other situation, some other person, some other thing. And every time we take refuge in our ego, we strengthen our ego. So continuing our understanding here, talking more from the Buddhist tradition, because they have an excellent, teachings on the ego. We need to understand that there are two profoundly different levels of what the ego is. And these are called, in the Mahayana tradition, the two obscurations: emotional obscurations and cognitive obscurations. And just as I had said before, the ego obscures the light. The ego obscures truth like clouds covering sunlight. This is what we mean by obscurations. So the light is shining, the light is pure, it's direct, but it gets filtered and obscured by these types of obscurations. Now, the word emotional obscuration probably doesn't come across our minds correctly, so instead of saying emotional obscuration, it's better, I think, to say afflictions, because we all know what it means to be afflicted, to have an afflicted mind. These emotional obscurations or afflictions, these are the kleshas. And in traditional teachings, they talk about three types, three root afflictions: ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And we commonly know them in different names and labels and forms, such as anger, fear, depression, anxiety, pride, jealousy. So how often do we feel any of these things? How often do we find our mind being pushed or pulled? That is an affliction. Your mind is afflicted by something. So some of these afflictions, again, they may be ego syntonic. So you don't recognize them as being wrong. But later on, they will appear as ego dystonic. And then you'll feel a lot of suffering. And then you'll know very much that you are afflicted. We carry our afflictions, I think most of us, probably the vast, vast majority of our life is in a moment or in a state of affliction. Well over 90%. Because we're asleep. Constantly churning our mind in certain ways. And these are afflictions when we think about something and we worry about it. Anything that has to do with our attachment, wanting to gain some situation, wanting to have some mental state, and then looking to organize the world in some way to achieve it because we're attached to having that mental state. This is all the afflictions. So easily we can see that there's a difference between the ego and the consciousness. Since I've been talking about the ego so much and all the qualities, which we have here on the left side of the slide, all of those 7 deadly sins and other ways of labeling different qualities of the ego. But what is consciousness? Because consciousness is not mechanical. It is not unaware. It is not identified. It does not place attention onto things inappropriately. So it possesses conscious temperance, selfless diligence, pure chastity, selfless love, sincere humility, selfless generosity, genuine happiness for others. And of course, these, again, are just labels or words. As we do the work and as we critically analyze and review our life, you become more aware of the theme, the taste of what the ego is, little by little. Because sometimes the ego feels like it's being diligent or having temperance or having genuine happiness for others. We are always confused, so we have to take everything very carefully, very analytically. We have to review very deeply. You cannot take something as the truth just because it feels like it should be that way. We have to reflect critically. So all of those qualities of the ego that I just mentioned, which are outward qualities, like pride and fear, these are all related to the afflictions. This is the side of the ego, which is, whether it's ego syntonic or ego dystonic, these are both the afflictions because they're tugging on the mind. They're afflicting the mind. Sometimes they afflict the mind, but it feels good. Ultimately, we'll feel suffering. That's all on the side of afflictions. We have not yet talked about the cognitive obscurations. So afflictions occur when we grasp towards our self, which is in quotes, because what the self is something we need to investigate. It is normal today to experience this 95 to 100% of the time. You may be astonished at that fact if you take it really literally, but I do mean it literally. We are afflicted 95 to 100% of the time. But don't take my word for it. Observe yourself. You'll find that it's difficult because your mind wants to go off in different ways. That's your afflictions. And how much of the day is spent not like that? So there's your answer. And this is the activity of what we would call the coarse aspect of the ego. What it means is that these afflictions are a representation or an exponent of our lack of knowledge about our true nature of self. We don't really know what we are. But because we have a confusion, we end up building these afflictions, these attachments. Now, what's very interesting is that the process of reaching mental tranquility inside of the exercise of meditation is exactly the process of temporarily overcoming the afflictions. If you achieve a state of mental tranquility, it's because you have temporarily overcome some aspect of your ego. Temporarily. So this is what meditation, the practice of meditation is. First and foremost, learning how to climb out, at least to some degree, climb out of your ego. Learn to rest all of those afflictions and get out of them. But they attract us. We are pulled by them, so it is difficult. But what's so beautiful is that we have this other thing called our consciousness. It has the capability of getting out, even temporarily. So afflictions are like a rope that has been knotted up. Those afflictions are the knots in that rope. When we learn how to meditate, we can temporarily know how to untie some of those knots. And we get a type of temporary liberation. And the more we learn how to relax and reflect and how to achieve tranquility, which is also sometimes called concentration, we begin to experience what having no afflictions is like. That's what mental tranquility is. It's true peace. It's really beautiful. It's very necessary to achieve this. It's very necessary to achieve this. We need to have the ability to go inside of ourselves and get out of our ego to some little degree. I'm not even talking about a profound degree, just the beginning of learning how to relax and get a little bit out of that afflicted state of mind. Then we begin to see with more clarity exactly what those afflictions are. You need some perspective. So without afflictions, you begin to see a conventional level of truth about yourself. Conventional in the sense that there's me and there's you. I said this and you had said that. And then when you had said this thing to me, I responded, I reacted. Why did I react that way? You begin to be able to observe the world in what we would call the conventional self, the conventional truth about how the way things are. So the afflictions are extremely deep, extremely pervasive. In Buddhist terms, the person who removes all of their afflictions has the title of Arhat. This is somebody who has achieved victory over the mind. So the afflictions are profound. Just because I am contrasting them with the cognitive obscurations, don't believe that the afflictions are something superficial. The afflictions go all the way down into our subconsciousness and unconsciousness, even into our infraconsciousness. There's a lot going on. But there is something else, which is the cognitive obscurations. Cognitive obscurations are even when our mind is in tranquility, it is still not viewing the full, unconditioned light of the Spirit. It's still viewing that light. It's viewing it without the afflictions. So it's very pure and beautiful and peaceful. But it is not the ultimate truth. Because there's still a sort of unawareness of the ultimate truth of reality. So people can achieve a certain state of meditation where they're not afflicted, and they believe that is the ultimate truth, but it's not. It's only a relative type of truth. They believe that because they temporarily got rid of their ego, that they've achieved ego death. But when they finish their meditation, they return, and the ego comes back. Because they just put the ego to sleep. They didn't get rid of it. They don't realize that there's a whole nother level of reality. So cognitive obscurations are always present, even during mental tranquility. So achieving the mental tranquility where all of your afflictions are at rest, there's still another type of obscuration called cognitive obscurations. How do you remove or how do you penetrate through the cognitive obscurations? This is only done through transcendent wisdom, what we can call gnosis. This is a much more subtle aspect of the ego. Instead of this being the unawareness of the true nature of self, cognitive obscurations is the unawareness of the true nature of reality. Those who have a type of very profound transcendent experience inside of meditation, they have a certain type of samadhi. These types of experiences are when those cognitive obscurations are temporarily overcome. Without cognitive obscurations, ultimate truth is experience, which is that rope, which before was knotted and now becomes unknotted because we're in tranquility, well, the truth is that rope doesn't exist at all. So we go from an afflicted state of mind, which then becomes an unafflicted state of mind. But the cognitive obscurations, still we have this sense of mind, this sense of self. We don't realize that the true nature of all this is something called emptiness, which is a topic we're not going to go into too many details right now, in which there is no difference, there is no self in that sense. There was no individuality. And that's an ultimate reality. So those who achieve the elimination of the cognitive obscurations, these are extremely elevated spiritual masters. There are very few of them. They don't come along very often. These types of individuals usually only appear publicly for some short period of time, and they always work hidden. But all the great founders of the great religions have achieved that, achieved the complete elimination of the ego, which is very difficult. So, to nail the point down even further with this slide here, there's temporary liberation and there's final liberation. Temporary liberation is when the ego is temporarily escaped. Final liberation is when you achieve the path of self-realization, which is something much more profound. You need the temporary liberation in order to work on your ego. If you use the temporary liberation only as a vacation, because you like to experience the bliss of tranquility, then you are developing a type of subtle attachment that's very poisonous for your spiritual work. You need to use those very nice experiences, those nice states, in order to work on yourself, to kill your ego, to eliminate your ego. And that's what we call the path. There's many aspects to the path, but the elimination of the ego is very, very, very necessary and unpostponable. We need to start right here and now. So after this long discussion about what the ego is and is not, now let's talk about the steps of psychological death, or ego death. There are three fundamental aspects: discovery, judgment, and execution. We can name discovery also observation. Judgment we can name also comprehension. And execution is the actual elimination of the ego. So observation means we need to become observant of our daily life. We walk around, we behave, we're identified with each moment, and we go to bed at night. And if we never remembered ourselves, then we weren't observing anything going on. We're just like a pinball in a pinball game, just being knocked around from impression to impression, from person to person, from task to task, from one thing to another thing. No consciousness, just action and reaction played out. To observe, we talk about observation a lot. It's the basic notion that you have the ability to pay attention upon yourself. We normally are very external. We are very materialistic. We pay attention to the sensations. We pay attention to those sensations of all the things that are in front of us. It's not that we need to ignore them, but we need to start paying attention to what's going on inside. There is some cause and effect relationship going on inside of ourselves, always. There's always some motivation. There may be motivations that are better or worse or neutral, but be aware of them. Become aware of them. What's going on inside of you is a complex series of interactions. There's a basic false notion that a lot of people have, which is that you are just who you are is like a blunt object, and there's nothing going on. That's just who you are. But that's a lie. That's false. Everything can be pulled apart. There's nothing in the world that can't be pulled apart. And you look at any type of physical object, it always can come apart. Even if it's a solid block of wood, you can splinter off all the pieces and you can pulverize it and reduce it to dust. So that block of wood looks like just all one thing, but in reality it's not. If you look closely, you can see different aspects, different shapes, different ways in which the wood is, different grains. It's not just one thing. Everything is like that. There's not, things only appear to be simple because we're lazy in the way we pay attention. But if you look critically at anything, you'll see it has many aspects, characteristics, features, spatial extension. Why would our ego be any different? Why would our ego be anything simpler than that? And wouldn't it even be more complicated? Because it's not just an object sitting there, it's an activity. So this is a sense we have to develop. It's difficult, but you have to continue to refine it, to see all those qualities within yourself. It's no different than a child learning how to walk, or how to ride a bike, or learning how to do something, that's physically demanding or requires precision. If you're right-handed and you try to write with your left hand, you're usually very bad at it. But the sense of observing ourselves is just like that. We're very bad at it first, but there is no other way around it. There's no option. Just keep practicing. And little by little, you develop that ability to see those things. So you discover yourself in daily life. When you pay attention, certain things about yourself become known. But we need to go deeper than that because we need to go into meditation. We need to learn how to meditate because we need to get out of the afflictions, at least for a little bit, even if it's just one little level of less afflictions, because there's levels. It's not just, a binary state. There's many stages to tranquility. And every stage is better than the previous one. But if we can learn how to meditate and remain at some level of peace for 20 or 30 minutes, even that's enough. And anyone can do that. That's where you start. And then when you're at that state, you're able to take those things you've discovered about yourself and go deeper. You're precisely capable of going deeper because you are no longer as afflicted. And you're able to see something about yourself. The light of your spirit is not as obscured. And therefore, you see things, you comprehend things at a deeper level. And finally, elimination or execution. This is a aspect where we need to make an appeal to something that's superior to ourselves. This is why we must pray for assistance. Because we're trapped and we need that type of intelligence or power which is beyond our situation in order to kill the ego at the very root. So in order to go into these stages a little bit more deeply, I've written out some notes that we'll go and read, and I'll explain them to you. In terms of discovery, observing one's life and remembering one's reality inevitably produces new information. So to observe one's life, this means to self-observe. And to remember one's reality, this means to have inner self-remembering. Inner self-remembering means that you're at least aware at some level that you are consciousness, there's an ego, and there's an inner spirit. And you're in the physical body. You're remembering your reality. However, whatever that means for you, at the level of your understanding. Remembering that, but also observing what's going on. That process will inevitably produce new information. We need that information. Because we're impoverished. We are the poor person. We are the poor man. We need the information. We need to become enriched with information. Periods in life without self-discovery indicate a lack of awareness, a sleeping consciousness. So if we are not discovering something new, if we are going through the days and the weeks and the months, and there's nothing new about ourselves that we know, well, this makes life very boring. We feel very bored by life. People go out and they look for other external sensations when this happens often. Suddenly they want to change their job and they want to have a different spouse and they want to do this and that, and they go searching elsewhere. But the real core is a lack of inner awareness. Because just like any object that you can look at, the closer you look at it, you discover something more about it. And what's more interesting than discovering yourself? So if we're going through periods of time and we don't see anything new, it's because we're not being aware. We're sleeping. We're being mechanical. It's an unfortunate truth, but it's the reality. With self-observation, at any moment in life, some previously unknown inner activity arrives within our awareness. So we don't know, but to remain aware, at some moment, that little aha appears or something suddenly feels bizarre. Why am I acting this way? What's happening now? What's going on? These little sparks. But we have to be sensitive to find them, to see them. Awareness, that is to say, our consciousness, has a spontaneous capacity unlike anything else. This quality of spontaneity, which is a quality of our consciousness, this is extremely important to understand. This type of spontaneity is not like, people say they're going to be spontaneous and they spontaneously book a trip to Paris or something like that. We're talking about spontaneity at a very root level, meaning the states of your mind is a continuum. When you observe yourself, it's like when you observe your mind, it's like a river. You're viewing things. Things are happening. There's streams of energy, streams of content, streams of information. Everything is based on the previous. This is what the cascade of different thoughts and feelings occurring, a chain. Suddenly, though, if you're very sensitive and you're very aware, the consciousness can observe something spontaneously, which we will say is not based on the previous moment. It's an authentically new piece of information that came directly from your inner light. That is the spontaneity that you need in order to crack open these problems. Because the ego is like a closed loop. The intellect knows how to traverse this closed loop. And this is why we think about the same thing over and over and over and over again. We don't get anywhere. There's no new information. The intellect can't crack the problem. But that spontaneous new information, which is coming from our inner spiritual light, which may just be a very small spark, that's the spontaneity that occurs, which illuminates something new. This quality of spontaneity, which is our root auto-luminosity, makes possible moments of self-discovery. The ego does not discover itself. It's our consciousness, through the light of our spirit, that illuminates it. Our self-illuminating consciousness gives light to all things in degrees. The intellect is the lower superficial aspect to this. Intellectual self-analysis is important, but just the beginning. As I said before, the intellect is not going to be able to eliminate our ego or even comprehend our ego. But at the same time, intellect can understand certain levels, superficial levels. And that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. There's sometimes a anti-intellectual vibe or current in some spiritual groups. This is a reaction. This is laziness. The intellect is just fine in its sphere. But outside of its sphere, it doesn't do anything good. You need to at least have some thoughts about why things are happening. But know that it's just at a certain level, and you have to go deeper. The consciousness shines brightest when it is not captured by conceptual fabrications. Rationality can compare and learn. Consciousness is direct perception of causes. Consciousness can directly perceive causality because it is beyond that. It is spontaneous. For those of us who are a little bit knowledgeable in Kabbalah, we know that the root of our consciousness is related to the world of causes. Ultimately, the consciousness has dominion in that world and beyond it as well. This is why when we meditate, we can get accurate comprehension of all those causes which produce our consciousness. And this is why we're able to get information that is truly spontaneous, that's outside this chain of our ego, which is self-enclosing, self-wrapping. We need to get out of that. And it's the consciousness that can do it. Observe your inner activity, all that which moves, and discover that your activity is not understood. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. When you observe, you will see that your mind is going in ways and you're not really sure what is going on inside of yourself from moment to moment. That's your confusion. That's your darkness. Little by little, you work to eliminate that. That's what it means to eliminate your ego. The next step is of judgment. Judgment is the definitive conclusion of that which has been observed. So you can't find comprehension or judgment if you don't have any type of observation. How could one judge some inner activity without comprehending what it is? To comprehend something, you need to remove the obscurations, at least temporarily. This was what I was talking about before. Afflictions, also known as emotional obscurations, prevent mental tranquility. Some amount of mental peace, at least for some moments, is absolutely required. Comprehension comes in degrees. It is totally fluid and dynamic. When you are comprehending your ego, first thing is that we want to find a very specific component that made itself known in some moment of life. We'll discuss this a little bit more later. But the comprehension of any particular aspect of ourself comes in degrees. To the degree which we comprehend it is the degree to which we can eliminate it. Many people want to think of the comprehension as a very simple, sort of, again, a binary state, but it's not. It's like shades of colors to go deeper and deeper. Liberation of the cognitive obscurations is best, yet not required to comprehend the coarser levels of the ego. At times, comprehension appears to be like accumulating grains of sand. Let me say that again. At times, comprehension appears to accumulate like grains of sand, little by little. Other times, comprehension is like a bolt of lightning, clear, precise, and overwhelming. Comprehension can appear within the exact moments of meditation. Comprehension can also appear after meditation, like a wave in the ocean you did not see coming. When you know the truth of something, you can judge it for what it is. The comprehension it's strange like that. Sometimes you know exactly that you've comprehended some moment of your life very deeply. Sometimes comprehension only appears after some moment of time and you realize suddenly that it's very clear. But in the meantime, when it was that accumulating like grains of sand, you couldn't tell that you were comprehending anything deeper. But then at some moment, it becomes obvious. And sometimes, again, these things happen while you're meditating, at those exact moments of meditation. Other times, comprehension appears, the strangest times, when you're taking a shower, or you're just getting ready for the day in the morning, or some other time. Suddenly, you realize something. And that is appearing in that way based on the efforts that you made in meditation. All of these different things can happen. But when it becomes clear at some level, then you can work with the third stage, elimination. Elimination of the ego is essentially a mystical process. The ego is a facet of our own karma. We are bound by our own prior mistakes. How can we be liberated if we are bound up? A force or intelligence superior to us. Without a force or intelligence superior to us, our situation would be hopeless. Thankfully, such force exists, and we possess an unbreakable connection to it. The elimination, the final stage of this, we have to give up all of our self-will and appeal to something superior, which is that spiritual light. But we, in this case, differentiate a certain quality of that light, which we call our Divine Mother. This force is the feminine aspect of our inner divinity. She is our Divine Mother, Kundalini. Ma is always there for us, whether we are doing right or wrong. She is necessary for the elimination of the ego. Divine Mother, which can also be called the Kundalini force, is a type of fiery activity that creates and destroys. In fact, when we create our ego, it's because we are using this aspect of creation in a negative way, and we create this ego ourselves by misusing it. When we comprehend our ego, we judge it for death. Then, if we ask, our mother will sever the chains definitively, which liberates that portion of consciousness which was trapped by the ego. Thus, we must pray to our inner Divine Mother with infinite longing and total surrender to eliminate that portion of ego we have previously comprehended within meditation. The Divine Mother awaits patiently for the moment her child asks for this. But she is demanding. She will only eliminate that which has been comprehended. We can't eliminate what we have not comprehended because that would be a folly. We would immediately recreate that aspect of our ego. Because ultimately, at the very root, people ask, how did the ego first get developed? This is also a mystical question. Our intellect wants a very chronological type of answer, with it, which has this concept of beginning and end. But ultimately, it's our own ignorance and our own confusion that caused our ego to be developed. But when we comprehend the ego, we have wisdom. We have the wisdom of that activity. We have the knowledge of it. So when we eliminate the ego, what remains is consciousness, which is awake, that's not conditioned by the ego, and it is knowledgeable. It has gnosis. It begins to understand the world and all of its levels and dimensions, little by little. So, to review, we first observe life, and then we take some moment of life which we observed to be difficult, let's say, some moment which was strange or we didn't understand. We take that into meditation. And we actually meditate on our ego. You find a lot of teachings on meditation. And most of the teachings that you find on meditation today are about taking a vacation, seeing if you can reach some state of quietude and bliss, tranquility. Now, all of this, as I said, is actually very much required, very good. But we are immediately saying that's not enough. To get there is good because then you can refresh yourself. For the same reason why it's good to take a shower every day. It refreshes your body, remove all the oils. But we need to take a shower for our soul every day, which is to meditate. Just in that aspect is very good. But to eliminate our ego, if we want to truly change our life, then we need to meditate on the ego, not just get out of it. Because you can meditate and get out of your ego for your whole life. And your daily living life will essentially be unchanged. If you want radical change, then when you reach some state of meditation, you have to turn the light of your consciousness, which you have now gained, back into your suffering. That's difficult because we don't like to do that. We'd rather just enjoy. We don't comprehend that ultimate liberation is what is necessary. So to conclude, or to begin to conclude, some time ago I was simply passing by a tree in nature, and I had walked by this tree a lot, but one day it just became very apparent that the tree was dying or basically dead. But prior to that, it didn't seem that way. So something very drastic happened quickly. I was reflecting upon this, and it was obvious that that tree must have been diseased before, and then one day, all the bark fell off of it, and it became quite obvious that it was very ill. It may already be dead, basically. And it made me reflect, and I said, actually, the ego is a lot like that. The way the ego dies is very misleading. Sometimes there are times when a tree is struck by lightning and the whole thing just explodes. It just gets obliterated. Sometimes the ego can be eliminated like that. That's a beautiful type of strong experience. But sometimes the ego dies like that tree, inside, and the shell of the tree remains for some period of time. And if we continue to do our work correctly, then the ego will die completely, deeply, through that mystical process of elimination. But sometimes the tree, even though it's mostly dead, sometimes it still seems to sprout some new branches, which is just strange, but that's the way nature works. You'll see one little new branch on a tree that's essentially dead. And our ego can be like this too, where we feel like we made some progress or we've reduced the ego. And if you don't cut the ego out by the root, then it begins to grow again. And all of a sudden things return. Sometimes we think we've eliminated the ego, and we didn't go deep enough. There's still roots, so it just comes up from the soil again. I've seen trees that have fallen over in the woods, and you would think the tree would be dead, but actually it suddenly starts growing. The tree is actually on the ground, and now there's roots or branches growing straight up again, like it's sprouting more trees from it. And nature works like this. So the ego works like this too, where we can do a lot of work and cause some type of elimination, but then if we don't really get it at the root, it starts to grow back. The ego is eliminated as well when you see for example, a tree that has been around for a long time and suddenly it's survived many storms, but suddenly, for whatever reason, this particular storm, the winds took it enough that it pulled over and got uprooted. Sometimes when we meditate, we're looking to meditate and penetrate our ego and to understand it deeper, and it feels like there's nothing going on. But some other time, some other meditation, for whatever reason, at that time we do penetrate deeper. So the outwardly effects and how it looks from one perspective may be confusing. It could go both ways. So you have to be diligent and just keep trying to move forward and keep working and don't get too discouraged. You have to observe how nature works. It's not so simple. You can apply a force, for example. Let's say you have a glass on a table, and if you give it a small push, then it moves a couple centimeters, no problem. And you do it again, and it moves a couple more centimeters. And you keep applying the same amount of force, and the same result is that it keeps moving a couple more centimeters. But when it reaches the edge, and you apply the same amount of force as you did before, the result will be drastically different. Do you understand? It's the same amount of force, but the result is different because the condition of where that cup was different. We have to continue to apply the forces. Sometimes one meditation is not enough, but just because you didn't get the result you were looking for doesn't mean that meditation didn't do anything. Because finally, when the cup reaches the edge, one more application of the same amount of force, the cup falls and shatters. So the meditation on the ego is like that too. So we need to refine our understanding of how these inner activities actually are. Because it's just like nature, it's very complicated. There's a lot of different situations. And we become more familiar with the long-term results. We keep working. So, we'll be opening up to questions in just a moment. I want to end this lecture by imploring you to continue or to begin to work on your ego. If you want to remove your suffering, you have to eliminate your ego. There's no way around this. There's nothing more critical today. There's nothing more important. Spiritual experiences are wonderful and beautiful, but you have to eliminate your ego. That's more important. You have to look at yourself, dissect yourself, pull yourself apart. People are afraid to eliminate their ego because they're afraid of the annihilation of their self. This is partly because they've never experienced that unafflicted state of mind. They don't know what is beyond that. So that's another reason why you should learn to meditate. Because I assure you, if you eliminate everything that can die, the only thing that remains is what is eternal. That is not something to be afraid of. Everything that can die will. And if you can manage to eliminate everything that can be eliminated, then what you are left with is only that which is eternal. So we should proceed to that without delay, with extreme urgency, with extreme enthusiasm. The ego appears in all of these times where we don't realize it's the ego. We have an idea in our head of what the ego is going to be like when we discover it, and that prevents us from seeing it. But when you have these little attitudes about, little miserable attitudes, little ways in which your mind is afflicted, that should be your key to see that actually it's the ego right here and right now. And you have to get rid of all these ideas that you have. And if you're floating around in these ideas that you have a label of what your ego is, whether it's lust or pride or whatever. Those labels, they're fine for talking about the ego, but they are not good for eliminating the ego. They keep you trapped. So just like if you carefully, closely observe some object, you take 1,000, 1,000,000 words to describe what it is. You can't just say, "Oh, that's a hunk of wood." But that's just my pride. You need to know the qualities. Some simple label is never going to be enough. So get out of that. Look at it closely and carefully in meditation. Okay, so yes, we're going to open up to questions now. Can you explain how the ego is related to the klipot? Well, the klipot is a concept in Kabbalah, which is related to the inferior worlds, the inferno or hell. The klipot is, literal meaning is shells. These are the shells that surround our consciousness and trap it. So our consciousness is trapped. It's trapped in klipot, which is these inferior levels. So sometimes we say we're already trapped in the inferior worlds, but we have to understand that in context. There are certain opportunities. If all of our opportunities are completely exhausted, then we definitively submerge ourselves into those inferior worlds, and we go through a process of recycling, which is very painful, which is why it's better to eliminate our ego so that we can escape those types of inferior laws. But we all have a certain number of opportunities to do it. So the key plot is related to our ego. Okay, another question. What are impressions, and how do they relate to our ego in relation to our personal algorithm? Impressions are the information of our world, most easily understood as our sensory impressions, what we see, hear, touch through our senses. They form some impression of reality. And sometimes the impression is extremely distorted. This often happens when we have social interactions and we come across someone gives us the impression that they're angry at us, for example. It's a very simple example. Well, that's just their impression. That's just our impression. Is that objective? That's one layer of understanding the impressions. The impressions are coming in from the world, and we're immediately constructing. It's like we think that the impressions are a blunt, the blunt truth of the world. It's just the truth. But in reality, what we experience is an impression of the world. We don't have full knowledge and we don't have full perception. So what we have is an impression. That impression is actually a combination of what we would call the raw data of the world combining or crossing with our personal algorithm, our mechanical states, because we can say the quality of that energy coming in immediately has a sort of harmony of attraction with certain qualities of our ego. Just like when you have two tuning forks, if you've ever seen that, harmonic resonance, if you hit one, the other one starts to vibrate as well. So the impressions, it's this raw data coming in, and then something about our ego immediately harmonizes with it, and we form this impression, and we think the impression is reality. But actually it's some mixture of what we're bringing into it and what this raw data is. And then things look like what they're not. And we only need to learn how to transform the impressions. We need to learn how to not take in the world mechanically, even though the first instinctual level may be something related to our ego, something negative. We see someone else who gets a promotion at work instead of us, and immediately we feel hurt by it. We feel like I deserved that. So there's an impression there, and there's activity of your ego there. And if you're not careful, you're going to believe that it's the objective truth of what you're saying, but in reality, you're just getting the impression that you've been dismissed or made less than or something like that. So the impression is a whole topic, but it is related to the way the world comes in and the way our ego reacts to it. And we have to learn how to transform that so that we don't just go along with the current of the ego. The ego's like this boat ride, and it's always saying, come on, jump in, we're going to go for a ride. And it's very attractive. And we go on that river, and we start thinking and feeling in accordance with that stream of energy. To transform the impression is to comprehend and observe. No, that's the ego. There's a whole stream of thoughts and feelings, but that's all subjective and mechanical, and I have to observe it.
Instructor, can I just add something to that that's been helpful for me?
Yeah.
Something with impressions, or when I start believing my stream of whatever I think is reality. And something that I do is I stop and I say, do I know this to be 100% true? Right? And so what is the evidence for that? What is the evidence to prove that that is 100% true? So for example, if I say, oh, he's mad, like your example, he's angry with me. Okay, what is that 100% true? Or could I be making that up, like at least partially? And so what almost 100% of the time comes, to be the truth is I say, well, it's not 100% true. I do not know that to be 100% true. And what evidence do I have to show me that he is angry? Well, he looked at me funny. Okay, can that look be maybe because he just glanced at me and I just took it as him being angry at me? Maybe he was just, quickly looking at or thinking about something else. So when I break it down like that and I ask for the evidence and I ask myself, do I know this to be 100% true? Almost, I think 100% of the time I find the answer is no. And that's when I know I'm becoming identified or I'm not transforming the impression. But just by asking that question, I start to not be mechanically looped into that ego or that impression.
Yeah.
So that's just a little tool that's helped me a lot to just stop myself from doing that. So.
Yeah, thank you. Great example. Yeah. Because that's just the conventional truth. You don't need any mystical experience to tell you a lot of that information. You just need to calm down and get out of the ego a little bit, and you can just begin to see even that. How do we avoid dividing ourselves between a superior and inferior eye? Well, so there is always a danger in when you're working on the ego of developing an alternate sort of superior, prideful, spiritual ego, which is so insufferable and it poisons all sorts of groups. It's hard because we want to be this better person. We have these aspirations, but it's very poisonous. We have to humble ourselves incredibly and work directly with patience. And when we believe ourselves I think the superior eye, quote unquote, a lot of times people confuse the intuitions of the consciousness with what I would call strong feelings. Sometimes we feel so strongly about something that it feels like this must be the truth. I have such a strong impulse to tell them this or to do this thing. And we think, well, because it's so strong, that must be my real self doing that. But a lot of times, I would even say most of the time, it's not. It's your ego, just your instincts, just reclothing itself into a spiritual aspiration. So reflect a lot. You have to humble yourself incredibly. People think that just because someone might have a meditative experience and it's beautiful and it's true. A lot of people have that. And unfortunately, some people think they're somehow special now. And they go around with that spiritual pride. And that's very wrong. We all have the capability of doing that, so none of us are special. Another question. How do we know when an ego has been fully eliminated? The full elimination of an ego can be elusive. That's partially why I talked about how a tree dies in different ways. Sometimes we have the fortune of having an experience that's very clear in the internal worlds related to that. But sometimes you may not know for a long time. All you know is that you keep working on some ego every time you see it and ask for the elimination and comprehend it as much as you can. And give thanks and move on to the next ego that you see. And eventually you will be eliminating egos. And it's better to assume that there's still something there that's deeper. So I think in some sense, this problem of knowing when something's been fully eliminated, that's a problem for the ego. For us, let's just put one foot in front of the other and keep eliminating what's in front of us. And eventually we'll get to our destination. Following question, how can we recognize the spirit? Recognizing the spirit, this is something that takes familiarity, because we're very naive. Again, we have to be very humble, and we confuse our intuitions with our instincts. But little by little, when we meditate more and more, we become familiar with the states of consciousness which are more liberated. And then we can know, sometimes it's explained as a different taste, but this is just an analogy, to have the taste of the spirit versus the taste of the ego. In the same way that if you don't know what a certain food tastes like, you just don't know. You're naive to it. You have to experience it. Unfortunately, a little bit of that is related to this question. As we continue to meditate, we just become more familiar with it, ultimately. But again, we always have to be reflective. Always reflect and always go deeper. Don't make any too simple of an assumption when talking about what is the ego and what is the spirit. Daily meditation is really the key. Okay, there's a question about the ego and concentration and individuals that are trying to awaken with the ego. Because there's certain types of groups and teachings that talk about, trying to awaken and have experiences, but they're not talking about eliminating the ego. It is possible to little by little become very aware of how your ego works, but you have no sort of concern about eliminating it. And therefore you have certain element of control over it, and you can, even learn how to meditate and know about your ego, and you become better at feeding your desires. These are traditionally called black magicians, whatever you want to call them. Individuals that know how to make use of the consciousness but they have no concern of limiting the ego. And in a temporary state, they can, have certain type of ability, capacities. Ultimately, it's very, very bad. You're going to create a lot of karma and a lot more suffering for yourself. So an individual who's going down that route, they're little by little awakening inside of their ego and growing their ego as well. And they hope to become fully conscious. They want to somehow merge their consciousness with their ego. That doesn't work, though. Another question. In relation to eliminating the ego, I was performing self-observation during the day, meditating on defects at night. Felt like the experience was intellectual, or much more like memory. I was doing my actions in meditation from memory. I have not perceived my consciousness to be doing this type of work. I have since stopped this method and went back to continuing or trying to reinforce my observation/visualization and meditation. Can you provide some advice on what to do? Should I continue to, quote unquote, eliminate the ego at my level? So this is a great question, because the practical reality is sometimes it's very difficult. Sometimes day by day we're sort of experiencing the same impressions over and over again, or we start trying to work on our ego and it gets a little routine, like there's a mechanicity there. Certainly sometimes if we feel like we've become mechanical, we can try to do something else, do some other types of practices. We have, practices like the runes or the exercises of rejuvenation, things like that, which may help, for example, move the energy in your body in a new way to sort of help prime the pump, so to speak, with your meditative practice. And doing things like pranayama also prime the pump, because when you move those vital energies, they help move the interior, the more subtle energies more, in such a way that you can have more penetrating insight. Everything becomes under more harmony, greater. The core thing in this type of situation is to relax more. You need more relaxation. You're meditating with too much tightness, and you have to abandon the intellect. Typically we like to visualize a scene. When you visualize that scene, which is some moment that you've observed, which you want to work on deeper, you have to abandon your intellect. So you just see it, but you're not commenting on it with your intellect. And you're looking at it closely. You're looking at the mental activity and the emotions that are aroused in relationship to bringing up that scene in your consciousness again. And if you're too tight in holding that, and you're trying to force comprehension, it won't happen. So you need to loosen. You need to relax. You need to become more drowsy. Now, of course, the danger is it's difficult because you become too drowsy to start falling asleep. But my recommendation in this sense is to relax more, and also combine it with either pranayama or a mantra. We just put a mantra on the YouTube page, the Prajnaparamita mantra, just gate gate. It's a great mantra. That type of mantra, doing that for some period of time before or after the visualization, will help really combine these forces in such a way that it will refreshen and hopefully work better. When Samael writes about killing desire and its shadow, going with your reference to the tree, would desire be the tree above the ground and the shadow of desire be as the root? Yes, you could say that when we say we need to kill desire and even the shadow of desire, that is referring to those deeper aspects within ourselves that we don't really see yet. So in this analogy, you could say you have to not only kill the tree, but you have to dig up the root. Because if you don't dig up the root, then those seeds, sometimes in Buddhism they're called the seeds, those seeds of the ego re-flourish. How do I meditate on my ego and separate it from the impressions of my experience? Using your example of being looked over in some way compared with other colleagues that bring sadness or whatever. But then how do I meditate to figure out what ego is at work and what does that look like? An example of the process. So going back to the scenario of feeling less than or being looked over, feeling like you weren't appreciated. Obviously, you have a bunch of words right at the beginning, which are a bunch of labels. And this is what I was saying before. The labels aren't enough. When you go into meditation, you're visualizing you're going back to that moment. You're visualizing it. Well, now what you observe is what's happening inside of yourself. And you may be immediately impelled to put words to it, but that's not what we want to do. You need to become acquainted with that feeling. Because at an instinctual level, when we feel that discomfort, we run away. Even if we're not physically running away, but in a subtle way, we're running away. The core feeling happens and we subtly run away, put in a label, say, oh, well, my feelings got hurt. But that was you taking what was really there, putting it in a little box and shoving it to the side. What are the feelings? And in the same way that when you look at something very closely, you can't just put one word on it. And in fact, I don't want you to put any words on it. To just see it for what it is. The same thing when you start observing the world. You observe an apple in front of you, but you don't need to put any words to that observation. Just see it. And you, of course, to work with all these, with the meditation, and if you are able to just be with it for longer and longer periods of time, you're going to have a better and better understanding of that process, what it is. And it's beyond the intellect. That's why it's so challenging to talk about it. But you have to just keep going deeper. And as I said before, it's good to combine all these things with things like pranayama and mantras to sort of energize our consciousness so that we can get better at understanding these things. Now, the other half, which I didn't mention too much, sometimes we do need to develop more concentration, better. We need to get better at getting to better tranquility. But if we're meditating every day, we're sort of practicing that anyway. And as we meditate more and more, we're able to get to more tranquility. And the more tranquility that we have, the deeper we can go. Beyond stopping from identifying with the impression, assuming we have managed to do that. But then what? You're left with an emotion that emanated from a misperceived impression. What, where, how can I identify the ego at this point? So if you identify, you're not identified with the impression. When you're not identified with the impression, you see some impulse immediately, and you're able to see it as an impulse of the ego, a mechanical impulse. Well, now you know it's there, and now you have to look at it. It's right there. There's nothing more to it. It's right there. Look at it. And it sounds terse, but that's when you see your phone in your hand, it's there. You look at it, you see it, you observe it. When you see the impression and you're not identified with it, then look at the activity. And of course, the response might be, "But I can't. I don't know what that means. It's all very vague." This is because our inner sense is atrophied. Keep working. Just keep working, and you can follow those. Become familiar with those things. And in the moment, the oppression is very elusive, but that's why you have to go back into deeper meditation and try to go deeper. There is a question about ego death in relationship to the use of psychedelic drugs. This is a good question, and a topic I meant to actually mention during the lecture itself. Yes, this term ego death has been used quite a bit amongst the so-called psychedelic counterculture thinkers. Obviously, these substances produce certain effects, and they produce a experience which is either removed completely or somewhat from our normal materialistic senses. Unfortunately, these experiences are often misinterpreted as purely spiritual experiences when they can actually still maintain a tremendous aspect of our subjective ego. Now, all of us are, as a society, we are all very quite dull-minded and materialistic, even if we consider ourselves to be otherwise. We're very closed off to anything but the material sensations. So when someone has a type of experience related to some of these substances, the fact that they experience something outside of their normal type of reality is enough for some people to provide a turning towards or searching for something more spiritual in their life. So this has happened for many people. On the other hand, if we look at the total corpus of all of that culture of the psychedelic groups and movements that are looking to fundamentally change or a radical type of revolutionary awakening of consciousness, that type of thing has not happened. And this is because psychedelics can't do it. So psychedelics are not a type of path that one can take in order to eliminate their ego. Psychedelics don't provide a development of one's heart. It does not develop compassion or comprehension. What does develop those things is meditation. So ultimately, these psychedelic substances are not needed. And in our culture, there's much, much greater danger for them to be used inappropriately and incorrectly. So just because there's an experience where it seems like someone's gone out of their body, for example, just because you have that type of experience doesn't mean you're free of the ego, in the same sense that, every night when you go to sleep, you are experiencing something that's not related to the physical world. But those dreams that you have, and if you become aware and awaken them, they could become very clear, very visually clear. Just because you're having that type of clear experience and it's not related to the physical world, that doesn't mean that that dream is somehow free of ego. And we know in dreams very strange things can happen, and there are some dreams which are very of a higher spiritual nature, and there's some dreams which are we call nightmares, which are very disturbing and difficult. And we can see through psychedelics the whole array of experiences like that can occur. But ultimately, there's a lot of problems. So we don't recommend ever the use of these psychedelics, primarily because there is a much more superior method. And what we're actually looking for is comprehension. And meditation is the way to do that. So someone who attempts to awaken their consciousness through repeated psychedelic experiences will find that ultimately their day-to-day life is more or less the same. There's somebody who had some experiences, but they come back and they have to live their life. The only thing that's going to change ourselves, and the only thing that really matters, is a psychological change that comes about through our deep comprehension of our own self. And having some type of laser light show or pyrotechnics going off in some trip or experience provides very little or basically nothing in order to understand this world that we're in. So for those individuals that found a spiritual path because they had some psychedelic experience, and that's good. There's many people who did all sorts of things that have nothing to do with spirituality, but as a result, they find their way into a spiritual path. There's also more modern, it's now more fashionable to talk about the indigenous tribes of America, Central America and South America, that had certain rituals and a tradition related to some psychedelic substances. In terms of those cultures, obviously there's a tradition there. Once again, though, just because there is a tradition, it doesn't mean that that tradition is complete, or that the individuals doing those types of practices and rituals are actually awakened individuals themselves. Every religion across the world has degenerated. We may know this through our own experience of the culture and religion we were growing up in, but just because there's another culture and another religion in another part of the world that you haven't experienced doesn't mean that other religion is completely pure. So there's a whole set of other issues there. Fundamentally, these are substances that, in a very specific sense, if you were an awakened being that knew how to apply a certain substance, then so be it. Just in the same way that a trained physician can give a prescription based on their knowledge of how medicine works and how the body works. But to take some of these substances just because you want to have an experience is wrong. If you try to take a shortcut in spiritual means and methods, you'll end up with spiritual indigestion. And it's a very real thing that you can form a type of psychedelic ego, an ego that is all wrapped up in these psychedelic experiences, which is just another form of the ego. The founder of the tradition that we're speaking from now, Samael Aun Weor, he was very familiar with and lived with the indigenous people of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. And he knew these practices very well. But he recommends that we do not take any of these substances. Meditation is really the way. I think we're going to have to close for questions. I apologize, since we're already at over 2 hours. But we are going to do a short meditation on the ego. Let's take a brief break, and then we'll have a short meditation on the ego. Okay, as you can see, the slide giving some instructions. So as I'm talking, begin to find a comfortable position. You can even lay down if you wish, but only if you're able to prevent yourself from falling asleep. Obviously, that's the goal, is to not fall asleep. Begin to relax your body. Start to breathe easily. Just put yourself at rest. Close your eyes. Taking a moment to observe your breath, how it moves in and out. Let go of all those muscles in your chest, your diaphragm. And breathe naturally. Learn to relax. All the muscles in your face should be relaxed. In your hands, in your feet, and your legs, your back, your neck, and your shoulders. The goal of this meditation is to observe some moment in our life in the past week, some time when you were afflicted. So you can begin to review, or if you already know a moment, you can go straight to it. Any time that you felt afflicted, hurt, angry, sad, impatient, jealousy, fear, anxiety, worry, stress, all of those things are afflictions. And this is where it gets difficult because immediately we want to jump back into them. And we have to develop this sort of, it's like developing a muscle almost. We have to resist the temptation. Even though we're afflicted by like some anxiety, we're at the same time attracted to it. We get pulled into it. That attraction is that what we call identification. So this can be difficult, but you have to try to relax and at the same time see this affliction, this afflicted moment. You choose one, just one moment, and you visualize that scene. You try to just see it, and things are going to come up. Just see those things that are coming up. Don't want to be attached to them. You don't want to judge them as good or bad. Just observe. Particularly, you observe exactly what is coming up. You may at that point then reflect on the question, what I is suffering? Now, if you lose your awareness or begin to daydream, it's okay. You can open your eyes a little bit, but try not to move. Just open your eyes for a moment, take a breath, and restart the practice. Sometimes that helps. If we feel like we keep getting stuck in our own daydreams. So those are the instructions, and let's begin. Okay. You can open your eyes. Come back to the impressions of the external world. And that's going to conclude our session today. So thank you.